David Martinez stood in front of his bathroom mirror, adjusting his tie for the third time in 5 minutes. The navy blue silk felt foreign against his neck after 2 years of casual Friday every day. His reflection stared back with equal parts determination and terror, the look of a man about to jump out of an airplane without checking if his parachute was properly packed. "You can do this," he whispered to his reflection, then immediately felt ridiculous for giving himself a pep talk. "It's just coffee. People have coffee all the time. Normal, functional adults who don't talk to mirrors." The sound of small feet thundering down the hallway interrupted his self-deprecating monologue. 9-year-old Tommy burst through the bathroom door without knocking, a habit David had been trying to break for months. "Dad? Why are you wearing the fancy tie? The one Mom bought you for?" Tommy's words caught in his throat as he processed the scene before him. His father, dressed in his best shirt, cologne lingering in the air like evidence of premeditation. "I'm meeting someone for coffee this morning, buddy," David said, trying to sound casual while his heart hammered against his ribs. "Remember I told you about Sarah? She's the librarian from your school." Tommy's eyes narrowed with the suspicious intensity of a detective who'd just found the murder weapon. "The pretty one with the sparkly earrings who helped me find that book about dinosaurs? That's her." David turned back to the mirror, missing the calculating expression that crossed his son's face. "Mrs. Peterson is going to watch you for a couple hours." "But it's Saturday," Tommy protested, his voice carrying that particular whine that could shatter glass and parental resolve in equal measure. "Saturdays are our days. We always make pancakes and watch cartoons, and you let me put way too much syrup on everything." David's hand froze halfway to his hair. Guilt, that faithful companion of single parenthood, settled on his shoulders like a weighted blanket. Tommy was right. Saturdays had been sacred since Lisa died. Their day, their tradition. "We'll do all that when I get back, I promise. Sarah seems really nice, and I thought—" David trailed off, unsure how to explain to a 9-year-old that loneliness felt like a physical ache some days, that conversations with adults about something other than homework and bedtime stories might help him remember who he used to be. "Does she like dinosaurs?" Tommy asked, crossing his arms in a pose that reminded David painfully of Lisa when she was being stubborn about something. "I don't know yet. That's why people have coffee, to find out what they like." As Tommy nodded solemnly, as if this explanation made perfect sense. "Can I come with you?" "Not this time, buddy. Adult coffee is different from kid coffee, more boring. Lots of talking about grown-up stuff like taxes and whether the weather's been strange lately." "Oh." Tommy's shoulders sagged in defeat, but David caught something else in his expression, a flicker of something that looked almost like relief. "Well, I guess I'll just stay here with Mrs. Peterson and definitely not do anything interesting while you're gone." The emphasis on "definitely not" should have been David's first clue that trouble was brewing, but he was too busy trying to remember how to be charming to notice that his son was already 3 steps ahead of him. An hour later, David sat across from Sarah Chen in the cozy corner booth of Moonbeam Coffee, desperately trying to remember what people talked about on dates. Was this a date? Coffee could be friendly, platonic. Completely innocent adult interaction between 2 people who happened to find each other moderately attractive and intellectually stimulating. "So," Sarah said, wrapping her hands around her mug like it was a life preserver. "This is nice. I mean, getting out of the library on a Saturday. Usually I'm reorganizing the children's section or explaining to teenagers that manga isn't actually corrupting their minds." David laughed, a real laugh that surprised him with its rusty sound. "Tommy's obsessed with those graphic novels. He brings home stacks of them every week. I keep waiting for him to move on to something else, but he's dedicated to his hobbies. He's a sweet kid, really bright too. Last week he asked me if we had any books about advanced chemistry for beginners. I wasn't sure if I should be impressed or concerned." "Impressed," David said automatically, then paused. "Wait, advanced chemistry? He told me he needed help with a science project about plants." Sarah's brow furrowed. "Plants? No, he was very specific about chemistry. Something about making things change color safely. He said it was for an experiment." Before David could process this information fully, his phone buzzed against the table. Mrs. Peterson's name flashed on the screen and a cold dread settled in his stomach. "Excuse me," he said to Sarah, swiping to answer. "Mrs. Peterson? Is everything okay?" "Oh, David, dear, I'm so sorry to bother you," came the elderly woman's voice, high-pitched with anxiety. "But there's been a tiny situation. Nothing dangerous, mind you, but, well, your kitchen is currently bright purple." David blinked slowly, certain he'd misheard. "I'm sorry, did you say purple?" "Violet, actually. A lovely shade, really, but quite extensive. It's on the walls, the ceiling, the refrigerator. Tommy says it's science, but I'm not entirely sure science is supposed to be quite so vibrant." Through the phone, David could hear Tommy's voice in the background. "It's an experiment about pH indicators. Totally educational." "I'll be right there," David said, already reaching for his jacket. He looked at Sarah, whose expression had shifted from confusion to barely contained amusement. "I am so sorry, but I think my son may have just turned our kitchen into a chemistry lab." "Advanced chemistry for beginners," Sarah said, nodding knowingly. "Should I be impressed or concerned?" "Both," David said, standing up. "Definitely both." Sarah stood as well, gathering her purse. "Mind if I come with you? I have to admit, I'm curious about this experiment. Plus, I might be able to help. I did major in chemistry before I became a librarian." David stared at her. "You majored in chemistry?" Surprised. Most people assume librarians were English majors who couldn't handle the real world. "No, it's just..." David shook his head, a smile tugging at his lips despite the purple kitchen crisis awaiting him at home. "My son asked the librarian about chemistry books, and it turns out the librarian is actually a chemist. That's either incredible luck or your son is more strategic than you give him credit for," Sarah finished, her dark eyes sparkling with mischief. As they walked toward David's car, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just been outmaneuvered by a 9-year-old. Tommy's request for advanced chemistry books, his suspiciously easy acceptance of the coffee date, his promise to definitely not do anything interesting. It all added up to something that looked remarkably like sabotage. But as Sarah slid into the passenger seat, laughing about pH indicators and the creative applications of red cabbage juice, David realized that Tommy's sabotage might have backfired spectacularly. Instead of ruining the date, his son had just given them an adventure. "Fair warning," David said, starting the engine. "My house might look like a crime scene from a very colorful murder." "Even better," Sarah said, buckling her seatbelt. "I always wanted to solve a purple mystery." The drive home was filled with Sarah's explanations of natural pH indicators and David's growing appreciation for her laugh. Bright and genuine, like she found the world endlessly entertaining rather than exhausting. When they pulled into his driveway, Tommy was waiting at the window, his face pressed against the glass like a condemned prisoner watching for the warden. "He looks guilty," Sarah observed. "He looks strategic," David corrected. "There's a difference." They walked up the front steps together, and David couldn't help but notice how natural it felt, having someone beside him approaching his front door. It had been so long since he'd brought anyone home that he'd forgotten how a house could feel less like a fortress when shared. Mrs. Peterson met them at the door, her gray hair slightly purple at the tips, and her expression somewhere between exasperated and amused. "I've seen some things in my 73 years," she said by way of greeting, "but I've never seen a kitchen that looks like it belongs in a Dr. Seuss book." "Mrs. Peterson, this is Sarah," David said. "Sarah, Mrs. Peterson. She's been keeping Tommy from burning down the house for the past 2 hours." "Oh, it wasn't fire we were worried about," Mrs. Peterson said, shaking Sarah's hand. "It was the complete redecoration of your kitchen. That boy of yours has quite the artistic vision." They followed her toward the kitchen, and David heard Sarah's sharp intake of breath before he saw the full extent of the damage. His kitchen, his normal, beige, adult kitchen, now looked like someone had detonated a grape bomb. Purple streaked the walls in abstract patterns, pooled on the countertops, and somehow splattered across the ceiling in a way that defied both gravity and common sense. Tommy stood in the center of the chaos, wearing his school clothes and an expression of pure innocence, that fooled absolutely no one. "Hi, Dad," he said brightly. "Hi, Miss Chen. Look, I made our kitchen more colorful. Isn't it great?" David opened his mouth to respond, but Sarah stepped forward first, her hands on her hips in a pose that was both authoritative and somehow fond. "Tommy Martinez," she said, her librarian voice carrying just enough authority to make Tommy's eyes widen. "What exactly were you trying to prove with this experiment?" Tommy's innocent expression cracked slightly. That chemistry is fun? And what did you actually prove?" Tommy glanced between his father and Sarah, clearly calculating his options. Finally, his shoulders slumped in defeat. "That I don't want Dad to go on coffee dates without me, because what if he likes the coffee lady more than he likes me?" The kitchen fell silent, except for the gentle drip of purple liquid from the ceiling into a strategically placed bowl. David felt his heart crack open just a little bit more, the way it had been doing in small increments since Lisa died, not breaking exactly, but expanding to accommodate new kinds of love and loss and hope. He knelt down in front of Tommy, not caring that his good pants were about to meet the purple floor. "Buddy," he said softly, "there is nothing and no one in this world that could make me like you less. You're my son. You're the most important person in my life. That's never going to change no matter how many coffee dates I go on or librarians I meet or purple kitchens you create." Tommy's lower lip trembled slightly. "But what if you get married again and forget about Mom?" David pulled Tommy into his arms, breathing in the scent of his son's hair, shampoo and mischief, and something uniquely Tommy that had the power to mend every broken piece of David's heart. "I could never forget Mom," David whispered. "She's part of you, which means she's part of me forever. And anyone I spend time with needs to understand that." Over Tommy's head, David met Sarah's eyes. She was watching them with an expression so soft and understanding that it made his chest tight, with something that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite hope, but lived somewhere in between. "Tommy," Sarah said gently, settling into a crouch beside them. "Can I tell you something about chemistry?" Tommy nodded against his father's shoulder. "The most interesting reactions happen when you combine different elements. They don't replace each other. They make something new together. Something that couldn't exist without both parts." She gestured around the purple kitchen. "Like your experiment, you combined cabbage juice with something alkaline, baking soda, I'm guessing, and created something beautiful and unexpected. The cabbage didn't stop being cabbage, and the baking soda didn't stop being baking soda. They just became something more together." Tommy pulled back from his father's embrace, considering this. "So if Dad likes you, it doesn't mean he stops liking me?" "Exactly. It means there's more room for liking people. Hearts aren't like jars that get full and can't hold anything else. They're more like—" Sarah paused, looking around the chaos of the kitchen. "Like your purple paint. The more you add, the bigger the picture gets." Tommy nodded solemnly, as if this made perfect scientific sense. Then his eyes lit up with mischief again. "Does this mean you're going to help us clean up my chemistry experiment?" Sarah looked around the purple disaster zone, then at David's hopeful expression, then back at Tommy's gap-toothed grin. "Only if you promise to ask permission before you turn any more rooms into art projects." "Deal," Tommy said, sticking out his hand for a shake. As Sarah shook Tommy's purple-stained hand, David realized that his son's sabotage had accomplished something entirely different from what Tommy had intended. Instead of scaring Sarah away, the chaos had shown her exactly who they were, a slightly dysfunctional family still figuring out how to be whole again, complete with purple kitchens and emotional chemistry experiments. And judging by the way Sarah was already rolling up her sleeves and asking Tommy about the proper way to neutralize cabbage juice stains, it seemed she was interested in joining their particular kind of beautiful mess. "So," David said, standing up and surveying the purple carnage, "I think our second date is going to involve a lot of cleaning supplies." "Second date?" Sarah asked, raising an eyebrow. "Well, this disaster counts as our first date adventure. Coffee was just the warm-up." Sarah laughed, that bright, genuine sound that was quickly becoming David's favorite noise, and grabbed a roll of paper towels. In that case, she said, I can't wait to see what Tommy has planned for date number 3. Tommy, who had been listening to this exchange with growing satisfaction, grinned and headed toward the supply closet. Don't worry, he called over his shoulder. I've got lots of ideas. David and Sarah looked at each other, a moment of perfect understanding passing between them. They were both in for quite an adventure. 3 days after the Great Purple Kitchen incident, as it had come to be known in the Martinez household, David found himself staring at his reflection in the hallway mirror again. This time, however, he wasn't preparing for a date. He was preparing for what Tommy had dubbed a family grocery adventure, which, given recent events, sounded about as safe as juggling dynamite in a thunderstorm. It's just groceries, David muttered to himself, straightening his casual button down. Normal people buy groceries with their children all the time. How much trouble could one 9-year-old possibly cause in a supermarket? The universe, apparently, took this as a personal challenge. Tommy bounded into the hallway wearing his favorite dinosaur t-shirt and an expression that David was learning to recognize as plotting something spectacular. It was the same look Lisa used to get when she was planning surprise parties or rearranging furniture at 3 in the morning because she'd had a vision. Ready for our grocery adventure, Dad? Tommy asked, practically vibrating with excitement. Ready as I'll ever be, David replied, grabbing his keys and wallet. Remember the rules. Stay close, no running off to look at toys, and absolutely no chemistry experiments with household products. Got it, Tommy said, nodding solemnly. Then after a pause, what about accidental chemistry experiments? Especially no accidental chemistry experiments. What about no experiments of any kind, Tommy? We're buying food, not conducting scientific research. Tommy sighed dramatically. Fine, but you're really limiting my educational opportunities here. 20 minutes later, David was pushing a shopping cart through the automatic doors of Riverside Market, Tommy skipping alongside him with the enthusiasm of someone who'd had 3 bowls of sugary cereal for breakfast, despite David's attempts at portion control. The store was bustling with Saturday afternoon shoppers, families with screaming toddlers, elderly couples debating the merits of different brands of crackers, and college students who looked like they were shopping for the first time in their lives and weren't entirely sure what food was supposed to look like. Okay, buddy, David said, pulling out his carefully organized shopping list. We stick to the list, in and out in 30 minutes. Can we get the cereal with the prize inside? We have cereal at home. Can we get ice cream? We have ice cream at home. Can we get... Tommy, David said patiently, everything you're about to ask for, we probably have at home. Tommy considered this for a moment. Can we get Miss Chen? David nearly walked the cart straight into a display of seasonal gourds. What? Miss Chen. Can we get her? You know, like invite her to come grocery shopping with us. She probably needs groceries too. Everyone needs groceries. It's like a basic human requirement. We can't just get people from the grocery store, Tommy. They're not items on a shelf. But we could call her, Tommy persisted, pulling out David's phone from his back pocket with the stealth of a professional pickpocket. I know her number because she gave it to you after the Purple Kitchen thing, and you saved it under Sarah, chemistry emergency, which is weird, but whatever. When did you... David started, then stopped. Never mind, give me the phone. I'm just saying it would be more fun with 3 people. We could split up and cover more ground. Very efficient. And she probably knows which vegetables are the good ones because she's smart about everything. Before David could respond, Tommy had somehow managed to dial Sarah's number and hit speakerphone. The sound of ringing filled the produce section, causing several nearby shoppers to look their way, with expressions ranging from amused to annoyed. Hello? Sarah's voice came through the phone, slightly breathless. Miss Chen, Tommy shouted with the volume control of a carnival barker. It's Tommy. We're at the grocery store and Dad needs help picking out vegetables because he always buys the sad ones. David grabbed the phone, his face burning with embarrassment. Sarah, I'm so sorry. Tommy apparently learned how to operate a phone when I wasn't looking. Sarah's laugh came through the speaker, warm and delighted. He's not wrong about your vegetable selection skills. I saw what you had in your fridge when we were cleaning up the purple situation. Those carrots looked like they'd given up on life. "Hey," David protested, though he was smiling despite himself. Those carrots had character. They had wrinkles, Sarah corrected. And possibly their own zip code. They were so far past their expiration date. Tommy grabbed the phone back. "See? She knows about vegetables. You should come help us. We're in the produce section and everything looks the same to Dad. He's very confused." "I am not confused," David said loudly enough for the phone to pick up. "I just have different criteria for vegetable selection." "What criteria?" Sarah asked, clearly enjoying herself. "They have to be vegetable-shaped." The silence on the other end of the phone was followed by Sarah's snort of laughter. "That's your criteria? Vegetable-shaped? It's a perfectly valid system." "Miss Chen," Tommy said, his voice taking on a conspiratorial whisper that somehow managed to be louder than his normal speaking voice. "He once brought home a pepper that looked like it belonged in a horror movie. It had like tentacles." "Those weren't tentacles," David defended. "They were artistic protrusions." "I'm at the store anyway," Sarah said, and David could hear the smile in her voice. "Different store, but I could swing by yours. Someone clearly needs supervision in the produce section." "We don't need supervision," David started to say, but Tommy was already giving Sarah detailed directions to their exact location, including landmarks like the weird cheese display with the cow statue and the place where they keep the fancy crackers that cost more than Dad's shoes. 15 minutes later, Sarah appeared at the end of the produce aisle like a superhero arriving to save the day. She was wearing jeans and a soft green sweater that made her eyes look like dark chocolate, and she was pushing her own cart with the confidence of someone who actually knew how to shop for food. "Okay," she said, surveying David's cart, which currently contained a bag of questionable lettuce, 3 random items Tommy had snuck in when David wasn't looking, and a container of pre-cut fruit that was definitely overpriced, but seemed safe. "Let's assess the damage." She picked up the lettuce, examined it with the intensity of a crime scene investigator, and shook her head sadly. "This lettuce has seen better days, probably better decades." "It looked fine to me," David said defensively. "It's brown, David. Lettuce isn't supposed to be brown unless it's trying to become compost." Tommy, who had been watching this exchange with growing delight, tugged on Sarah's sweater. "Miss Chen, can you teach Dad how to pick good vegetables? Because if you don't, we're going to end up eating sad food forever." "Sad food?" Sarah asked, crouching down to Tommy's level. "Yeah, you know, food that looks like it's given up on being food. Dad's really good at finding sad food. It's like a special talent, but not a useful one." Sarah looked up at David, her expression caught somewhere between sympathy and amusement. "How have you been feeding this child for 2 years?" "Very carefully," David said. "And with a lot of takeout." "A lot of takeout," Tommy confirmed. "Like so much takeout that the pizza guy knows our names and asks about homework. Jimmy from Golden Dragon always remembers that I don't like water chestnuts." Sarah stood up, brushing off her knees. "Well, this is clearly an emergency situation. Tommy, I'm going to need your help. We're going to teach your dad how to shop for food that doesn't look clinically depressed." For the next hour, David found himself getting an intensive course in grocery shopping from a 9-year-old and a librarian/chemist. Tommy appointed himself as the official food inspector, carefully examining each item Sarah selected and providing running commentary on its emotional state. "This apple looks happy," Tommy announced, holding up a crisp Honeycrisp. "See how shiny it is? It's practically smiling." "And this lettuce," Sarah added, selecting a head of romaine that was actually green, "has a positive attitude about life. Very optimistic lettuce." "You're both insane," David said, but he was laughing as he said it. He couldn't remember the last time grocery shopping had been anything other than a chore to be endured. Now Tommy was creating elaborate backstories for produce, and Sarah was explaining the science behind how to tell if an avocado was ripe, and David was having more fun in the vegetable section than he'd had anywhere in months. They were debating the merits of different types of pasta when Tommy suddenly froze, his eyes wide with what looked like panic. "Oh no," he whispered, grabbing onto David's arm. Oh no, oh no, oh no. What's wrong, buddy? David asked, immediately scanning the area for threats. Are you okay? It's Mrs. Henderson, Tommy hissed, pointing toward the cereal aisle. From school. She's coming this way and she's got that look. David followed Tommy's gaze and spotted a woman in her 50s approaching them with the determined stride of someone with a mission. She was immaculately dressed, carrying her shopping basket like a weapon, and wearing an expression that suggested she had opinions with a capital O. Oh, wonderful, David muttered under his breath. Who's Mrs. Henderson? Sarah asked quietly. Tommy's third-grade teacher, David replied. She's enthusiastic about parent involvement. David Martinez, Mrs. Henderson called out as she reached them, her voice carrying the authority of someone used to commanding the attention of 8-year-olds. How lovely to see you. And Tommy, of course. She turned her hawk-like gaze on Sarah, taking in every detail from her casual clothes to the way she was standing close enough to David to suggest familiarity. And you must be... Mrs. Henderson's tone suggested she was prepared to conduct a full background check right there in aisle 7. Sarah Chen, Sarah said pleasantly, extending her hand. I'm the librarian at Tommy's school. Mrs. Henderson's eyes lit up with the kind of recognition that made David's stomach sink. Oh yes, I've heard so much about you. Tommy talks about you constantly. Miss Chen this and Miss Chen that. Just yesterday he told the whole class about your chemistry expertise and how you helped with his science experiment at home. David felt his face heating up as he remembered the Purple Kitchen incident. Of course, Tommy had told his entire class about that. It was quite an educational experience, Sarah said diplomatically. I'm sure it was, Mrs. Henderson said, her tone suggesting she was filing away every detail for future analysis. And how nice that you're spending time together outside of school. As colleagues, of course. The way she said colleagues made it clear she thought they were about as much colleagues as Romeo and Juliet had been casual acquaintances. Actually, Tommy piped up, apparently recovering from his initial panic, Miss Chen is teaching Dad how to buy vegetables that aren't sad. It's very educational. Did you know that brown lettuce is basically plant depression? Mrs. Henderson blinked slowly, processing this information. Plant depression? Yeah, Miss Chen knows all about it because she studied chemistry, and Dad's vegetables are basically a science experiment in how food gives up on life. David wanted to disappear into the floor, or possibly relocate to a different state. Mars seemed like a reasonable option. How interesting, Mrs. Henderson said, looking between David and Sarah with the intensity of someone solving a particularly complex puzzle. Well, I should let you get back to your educational grocery shopping. She turned to go, then paused and looked back at Tommy. Tommy, dear, don't forget that your family tree project is due next week. I'm looking forward to seeing how you present your family structure. With that loaded comment, she sailed away toward the frozen food section, leaving behind an awkward silence that seemed to have its own gravitational pull. Family tree project? Sarah asked quietly. Yeah, Tommy said, suddenly very interested in the nutrition label on a box of crackers. We have to draw our family and write about everyone. I've been putting it off because, you know. David felt that familiar tightness in his chest that came whenever Tommy's school assignments bumped up against the reality of their situation. A family tree that included a mother who wasn't there anymore. A father who was still figuring out how to be enough for both parents. A 9-year-old who was navigating loss in ways that most adults couldn't handle. Hey, Sarah said gently, kneeling down beside Tommy's cart. What if I helped you with the project? I'm pretty good at research, and family trees are just another kind of research. Tommy looked up hopefully. Really? Even though it's kind of complicated? The best families are complicated, Sarah said with a smile. Simple is boring. Complicated means there are interesting stories to tell. Can we include Mom even though she's not here anymore? Of course we can. She's part of your family. She always will be. Tommy nodded solemnly. Then his face brightened with mischief again. Can we include you? You know, as like a branch that's growing in? David nearly choked on his own saliva. Tommy. What? Tommy said innocently. She's part of our family now. She helped clean our kitchen and she's teaching us about vegetables and she knows about chemistry. That's totally family stuff. Sarah's cheeks turned pink, but she was smiling. I think your family tree should include whoever feels like family to you, Tommy. But maybe we should focus on the assignment requirements first. The assignment requirements are boring, Tommy said dismissively. Real life is way more interesting than assignments. As they finished their shopping, with significantly better produce than David had ever purchased in his life, David found himself watching the easy way Sarah interacted with Tommy, how she listened to his random observations about the world with the same attention she'd give to serious adult conversation. She didn't talk down to him or dismiss his ideas, even when those ideas involved classifying vegetables by their emotional states. At the checkout line, Tommy somehow managed to convince them to buy ingredients for homemade pizza, arguing that it would be educational to learn about yeast and fermentation. David suspected this was just Tommy's way of engineering another evening with all three of them together, but he found himself agreeing anyway. So, Sarah said as they loaded groceries into David's car, pizza night at your place? I promise not to let Tommy turn your kitchen purple again. I make no such promises, Tommy called from the back seat where he was apparently conducting a detailed inventory of their purchases. David looked at Sarah, this woman who had somehow become part of their chaotic Saturday routine, without him quite realizing when or how it had happened. She was laughing at something Tommy was saying about the optimal cheese-to-sauce ratio, and the late afternoon sunlight was catching in her hair, and David felt something shift inside his chest. Not the sharp pain of grief he'd grown accustomed to, but something warmer, something that felt like possibility. Pizza night sounds perfect, he said, but I'm buying a fire extinguisher on the way home, just in case Tommy's educational experiments get out of hand. Dad, Tommy protested from the back seat, I'm very responsible with my experiments. You turned our kitchen purple. That was educational and beautiful. Sarah laughed, that bright sound that was becoming the soundtrack to David's growing happiness. I love your family's definition of responsible. As they drove home, David caught Tommy's eye in the rearview mirror. His son was grinning with satisfaction, and David realized that once again Tommy's sabotage attempts had backfired in the most wonderful way possible. What had started as Tommy's plan to create chaos had instead created something that felt remarkably like the family they were all learning to become. The grocery store ambush had been a complete success, just not in the way anyone had planned. David stared at the crumpled flyer in his hand, reading it for the third time as if the words might somehow rearrange themselves into something less terrifying. Annual third grade spring play, The Adventures of Captain Planet and the Recycling Rangers. Parents welcome to volunteer for costumes, set design, and special effects. Special effects at an elementary school play. David had a sinking feeling that Tommy's newfound interest in chemistry was about to collide spectacularly with his school's theatrical ambitions. Dad, you have to volunteer. Tommy bounced on his toes beside David's desk, practically vibrating with excitement. Mrs. Henderson said they need people who understand science for the special effects, and you know all about engineering and stuff. I design HVAC systems, buddy. That's not exactly theatrical special effects. But you understand how things work, and Miss Chen knows about chemistry. You could work together, it would be like a team project. David caught the calculating gleam in Tommy's eyes and realized he was being manipulated by a 9-year-old mastermind. Again. Tommy, did you volunteer me for this without asking? Tommy's expression shifted to one of pure innocence, which was about as convincing as a chocolate teapot. I might have mentioned to Mrs. Henderson that you and Miss Chen would probably be really good at making the recycling transformation scene look realistic. You know, scientifically accurate. Scientifically accurate, David repeated slowly. Yeah. Like when Captain Planet teaches the kids about chemical reactions and they turn trash into useful things. Mrs. Henderson was super excited about it. She said it would be educational and entertaining. David groaned, already envisioning the disaster potential. Tommy, you can't just volunteer people for things without asking them first. But I knew you'd say yes because you like Miss Chen and she likes science. And I really want to be in the play, and Kyle Morrison said his dad is building a whole spaceship for the space scene, so we have to do something cool too or everyone will think our family is boring. The words tumbled out in one breathless rush, and David felt his parental resolve crumbling in the face of his son's logic. It was twisted logic, granted, but there was an undeniable thread of truth running through it. "What part are you playing in this play?" David asked, though he was afraid to hear the answer. "I'm Captain Planet's science advisor," Tommy announced proudly. "I get to explain how recycling works and demonstrate chemical reactions. Mrs. Henderson said I was perfect for the role because I already know about chemistry from the Purple Kitchen incident." David buried his face in his hands. The Purple Kitchen incident was apparently going to follow them for the rest of Tommy's elementary school career. 2 hours later, David found himself sitting in Sarah's cozy living room, explaining the situation while she made tea, and tried very hard not to laugh at his predicament. "So let me get this straight," Sarah said, settling onto her couch with 2 steaming mugs. "Tommy volunteered both of us to create scientifically accurate special effects for a 3rd-grade play about environmental awareness?" "That's the gist of it." David accepted his mug gratefully, inhaling the soothing scent of chamomile. "I tried calling Mrs. Henderson to explain that there had been a miscommunication, but she was so enthusiastic about having real professionals involved that I couldn't bring myself to back out." "Real professionals," Sarah repeated, grinning. "I love that my chemistry degree and your HVAC expertise somehow qualify us as theatrical special effects experts." "We could still say no," David offered weakly. "Tell them we're too busy with work or something." Sarah was quiet for a moment, sipping her tea and looking thoughtful. "Or," she said slowly, "we could lean into it. How hard could it be to create some safe educational special effects for a bunch of 8- and 9-year-olds? David stared at her. "You're actually considering this?" "I'm definitely considering it. Tommy's been talking about this play for weeks. He's so excited about his role, and honestly, it might be fun." "When's the last time you did something completely outside your comfort zone?" "Tuesday," David said immediately, "when Tommy convinced me to try that new sushi place and I accidentally ordered eel." "That doesn't count. I mean something creative. Something that has absolutely nothing to do with air conditioning systems or grocery shopping or any of the responsible adult things you usually do." David considered this. It was true that his life had become fairly predictable since Lisa died. Work, Tommy, home, repeat. The Purple Kitchen incident and their grocery store adventures with Sarah were the most spontaneous things he'd done in months. "What exactly are you proposing?" he asked. Sarah's eyes lit up with the same mischievous spark he'd come to associate with her best ideas. "I'm proposing we give those kids the most amazing, educational, totally safe chemical demonstration they've ever seen. We're going to make Tommy's play the highlight of the school year." "And if something goes wrong?" "Then we'll have a very interesting story to tell." Sarah set down her mug and leaned forward conspiratorially. "Besides, what's the worst that could happen?" David immediately regretted asking that question, because the universe had a well-documented sense of humor when it came to his family's adventures. The worst, as it turned out, was that Mrs. Henderson had apparently told the entire school about their professional special effects team, and expectations had grown considerably beyond what anyone had originally planned. "So," Mrs. Henderson said at their first planning meeting, her eyes bright with anticipation, "I've been thinking about how we can really make this production special. The PTA is very excited about having actual experts involved." David and Sarah exchanged a look across the cramped classroom where folding chairs had been arranged in a circle. About a dozen other parents were scattered around the room, most of them looking as overwhelmed as David felt. "What exactly did you have in mind?" Sarah asked diplomatically. "Well, the recycling transformation scene is the climax of the play. Captain Planet, that's little Jamie Chen, no relation I assume, teaches the recycling rangers about chemical processes that can turn waste into useful materials. I was hoping you could demonstrate some actual chemistry." "Actual chemistry?" David repeated, that familiar feeling of impending doom settling in his stomach. "Nothing dangerous, of course, but perhaps something visual, colorful." The children learn so much better when they can see science in action. Tommy, who had somehow managed to insert himself into the adult planning meeting, raised his hand enthusiastically. Ooh, what about the thing where you mix stuff and it changes colors, or the one where it bubbles up, or… Tommy, David interrupted gently, maybe let the adults discuss the technical details. But I'm the science advisor, Tommy protested. I should know about the science stuff. Mrs. Henderson beamed at Tommy's enthusiasm. He's absolutely right. Tommy's been such a wonderful resource for making sure our script is scientifically accurate. Did you know he suggested we include information about pH levels in our recycling song? David looked at Sarah, who was clearly trying not to laugh. Their son, because Tommy was definitely becoming theirs in ways that surprised David daily, had apparently turned his school play into an advanced chemistry lesson. What about bubble reactions, suggested Carol Martinez, Kyle's mother, who had been largely silent until now. Kids love bubbles and they're harmless. Ooh, or color-changing reactions, added Tom Bradley, whose daughter was playing one of the recycling rangers. My daughter saw something like that at the Science Museum and talked about it for weeks. Within an hour, their simple special effects demonstration had evolved into an elaborate chemical showcase featuring color changes, safe bubbling reactions, and what Mrs. Henderson enthusiastically called the magic of scientific education. This is getting out of hand, David murmured to Sarah as they walked to their cars after the meeting. This is getting awesome, Sarah corrected. Do you see how excited Tommy is? And honestly, it's been years since I got to do hands-on chemistry for an audience. This could be really fun. Fun, David said skeptically. You said that about the grocery shopping too. And wasn't that fun? David had to admit that it had been. In fact, most of his recent adventures involving Sarah and Tommy had been significantly more entertaining than his life used to be. What are you thinking for the actual demonstrations? He asked. Sarah's grin was pure mischief. Leave that to me. I have some ideas that are going to blow their minds. Safely, she added quickly, seeing David's expression. Very, very safely. 2 weeks later, David stood backstage at Roosevelt Elementary's multi-purpose room, surrounded by enough chemistry supplies to stock a small laboratory. Sarah had indeed blown his mind with her simple special effects setup. Okay, Sarah said, checking her list for the third time. We have the pH indicator demonstration with red cabbage juice, the elephant toothpaste reaction, scaled down for safety, the color-changing milk experiment, and the density tower for the recycling separation scene. And all of this is completely safe? David asked, eyeing the array of bottles and beakers nervously. Completely safe. I've tested everything twice. The most dangerous thing here is food coloring, and that's only dangerous if you're worried about temporarily purple fingers. Tommy appeared at David's elbow, resplendent in his costume as Captain Planet's science advisor. Mrs. Henderson had somehow found him a tiny lab coat and safety goggles, and he looked like the world's youngest professor. Dad, Miss Chen, are you ready for the science magic? It's not magic, buddy, David said automatically. It's chemistry. Same thing, Tommy said with the confidence of someone who'd never encountered anything chemistry couldn't solve. Chemistry is just magic with explanations. From the front of the room, David could hear Mrs. Henderson addressing the packed audience of parents, grandparents, and siblings. The entire school had apparently turned out for the play, and David's nerves ratcheted up another notch. And now, Mrs. Henderson's voice carried clearly backstage. Our recycling rangers will learn about the amazing science of chemical processes with a special demonstration by our parent volunteers. This was their cue. David looked at Sarah, who was practically glowing with excitement, then at Tommy, who was bouncing on his toes like a caffeinated kangaroo. Break a leg, Sarah said, squeezing David's hand. Please don't, David muttered. I'd rather break anything else. They walked onto the makeshift stage to enthusiastic applause. The audience was a sea of expectant faces, phones and cameras at the ready to capture whatever was about to happen. David spotted Mrs. Henderson in the front row, beaming with pride at her educational extravaganza. Citizens of Earth, Tommy announced in his best dramatic voice. Captain Planet's science advisor is here to show you the amazing power of chemistry. Sarah stepped forward with her first demonstration, the pH indicator experiment using red cabbage juice. As she added different household substances to the purple liquid, it transformed through a rainbow of colors: red, blue, green, yellow. The audience gasped and applauded with each color change, and David found himself relaxing slightly. This was actually working. Chemistry, Sarah explained to the captivated audience, helps us understand how different materials interact. Just like in recycling, when we understand the properties of materials, we can transform them into something new and useful. Tommy held up different colored solutions like a magician's assistant, his face serious with the importance of his role. See how the same liquid can be different colors? That's because chemistry is all about how things change when they meet other things. The next demonstration was the color-changing milk experiment. Sarah added drops of food coloring to a plate of milk, then touched the surface with a cotton swab dipped in dish soap. The colors swirled and danced across the surface like liquid fireworks. "Whoa!" gasped a voice from the audience, and David realized it was his own. Sarah grinned at him, clearly delighted by his reaction. "The soap breaks down the fat molecules in the milk," she explained, creating currents that move the colors around. "It's like a chemical dance party." Tommy nodded sagely. "Miss Chen knows about all kinds of chemistry. She helped my dad learn about vegetables, and she cleaned our purple kitchen, and she's really good at making science beautiful." David felt his cheeks warm as several people in the audience chuckled knowingly. Leave it to Tommy to turn a science demonstration into a matchmaking opportunity. The final demonstration was Sarah's pièce de résistance, a scaled-down version of the elephant toothpaste reaction. She carefully mixed hydrogen peroxide, dish soap, and food coloring in a tall container, then added a catalyst. The reaction was immediate and spectacular. Colorful foam erupted from the container in a controlled burst, growing into a towering column that drew gasps and applause from the entire audience. "This is what happens," Sarah explained as the foam continued to grow. "When we find the right combination of elements, they don't just coexist. They create something bigger and more amazing than any of them could be alone." Tommy looked up at the foam tower, then at David and Sarah standing on either side of him, and his face broke into the biggest grin David had ever seen. "Just like families," Tommy announced to the audience. "Different people can come together and make something awesome." The audience erupted in applause, and David realized that somehow, in the middle of an elementary school chemistry demonstration, his son had just delivered the most profound statement about their evolving family that David had ever heard. As they took their bows, Sarah caught David's eye and mouthed, "That went well." David was about to agree when he noticed that the elephant toothpaste foam was still growing and spreading, and apparently had no intention of stopping anytime soon. "Sarah," he said quietly, "is it supposed to keep doing that?" Sarah followed his gaze to where colorful foam was now oozing off the edge of the stage and threatening to engulf the front row of the audience. She said, her scientific confidence wavering slightly. "Not exactly." Tommy, oblivious to the potential foam disaster developing behind him, was still addressing the audience with the enthusiasm of a seasoned performer. "And that's why chemistry is the best science," he declared. "Because it makes everything more colorful and exciting, and sometimes it gets everywhere, but that's okay because it's educational." David looked at the expanding foam, then at Sarah's slightly panicked expression, then at his son, who was clearly having the time of his life, and started to laugh. Because this was exactly how things went in their family now. Beautiful, chaotic, slightly out of control, and absolutely perfect in its imperfection. The foam reached Mrs. Henderson's feet just as Tommy finished his speech, and she looked down at her shoes with an expression of scientific curiosity rather than dismay. "How fascinating," she announced to the audience. "A real-time demonstration of how chemical reactions can exceed our expectations. And somehow, in the way that only elementary school teachers could manage, she turned their minor disaster into an educational triumph." As they cleaned up the foam afterward, with the help of about 20 excited children who thought this was the best part of the whole play, David realized that Tommy's sabotage schemes had officially evolved into something far more sophisticated than purple kitchens and grocery store ambushes. His son was now orchestrating elaborate public demonstrations of their family chemistry, complete with actual chemistry and an audience of witnesses. And the most surprising part was that David didn't mind at all. David should have known something was up when Tommy asked to have a family meeting at the kitchen table, the same kitchen table that still bore faint purple stains despite their best cleaning efforts. In David's experience, 9-year-olds didn't call family meetings unless they were either in serious trouble or planning something that would put them in serious trouble. "Dad," Tommy began with the gravity of a Supreme Court justice delivering a landmark decision, "we need to talk about your dating situation." David nearly choked on his morning coffee. "My what now?" "Your dating situation," Tommy repeated patiently, as if explaining something obvious to a particularly slow adult. "It's been 3 weeks since the school play, and you still haven't officially asked Miss Chen to be your girlfriend." "Tommy, that's not how adult relationships work." "Actually," Tommy interrupted, pulling out a folded piece of paper from his back pocket, "I've been doing research." Of course he had. David was learning that his son approached life's challenges with the methodical precision of a military strategist. Tommy unfolded the paper, revealing what appeared to be a hand-drawn chart complete with arrows, timelines, and what looked suspiciously like a flowchart. "According to my research," Tommy continued, pointing to various sections of his diagram, "you and Miss Chen have been on 4 official dates. Those weren't all dates. Coffee was date 1, grocery shopping was date 2, the school play was date 3, and pizza night last Friday was definitely date 4. Plus, she's been to our house 6 times, you've been to her house twice, and you both get that weird smiley look when you talk about each other." David stared at his son's chart, which was disturbingly accurate and far more detailed than he was comfortable with. "Have you been keeping a spreadsheet of my social life?" "Not a spreadsheet, a scientific observation log. I'm tracking variables and patterns to determine optimal outcomes." "Variables and patterns," David repeated slowly. "Yeah, like how you always wear your blue shirt when you know you're going to see her, and how she always brings those cookies you like when she comes over, and how you both pretend you're not holding hands during movies, but you totally are." David felt heat creep up his neck. They had been holding hands during movies. When had his son become so observant? "Tommy, even if all of that is true," which it is, "relationships are complicated. Miss Chen and I are taking things slow because—" David paused, trying to find words that would make sense to a 9-year-old. "Because when you care about someone, you want to make sure you do things right." Tommy nodded seriously, as if this confirmed something he'd already suspected. "Which is why you need my help." "I need your help?" "Dad, no offense, but your track record with romantic gestures is not great. Remember the sad vegetables? And that time you tried to cook dinner for her and set off the smoke alarm twice?" David winced. The smoke alarm incident had been particularly embarrassing. "I've been thinking," Tommy continued, "about what Mom would want." The casual mention of Lisa hit David like a gentle punch to the chest. Tommy rarely brought up his mother in the context of David's new relationship with Sarah, and David had been carefully avoiding the subject, unsure how to navigate those complicated emotional waters. "What do you think Mom would want?" David asked softly. Tommy was quiet for a moment, his small fingers tracing the edges of his chart. "I think she'd want you to be happy, and I think she'd want me to have someone who knows about chemistry and vegetables and helps me with science projects." He looked up at David with eyes that were suddenly older than his 9 years. "And I think she'd like Miss Chen because Miss Chen makes you laugh the way Mom used to." David felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Buddy, so I have a plan," Tommy announced, apparently deciding they'd spent enough time on feelings and it was time to get back to strategy. "A really good plan that's going to fix everything." David was immediately suspicious. "What kind of plan?" "The kind where you finally ask Miss Chen to be your actual girlfriend and she says yes because obviously she already likes you, and then we can all stop pretending we're not already a family." "Tommy, I can't just ask her to be my girlfriend like we're in middle school." "Why not? You like her, she likes you, I like her, she likes me. It's basic math, Dad. 1 + 1 + 1 = family." David had to admit his son's logic was sound, even if his understanding of adult relationships was charmingly simplified. "What exactly are you proposing?" David asked, though he was fairly certain he didn't want to know the answer. Tommy's grin was pure mischief. "Leave that to me. I just need you to trust me and wear your blue shirt tomorrow." "Why tomorrow?" "Because tomorrow is Saturday, and Saturday is when all the best romantic stuff happens in movies." The next morning, David found himself standing in his closet, staring at his blue shirt and wondering how his life had reached the point where he was taking fashion advice from a 9-year-old. But Tommy had been right about so many things lately. Sarah's interest in chemistry, the family dynamics, even the optimal cheese-to-sauce ratio for pizza, that David was starting to trust his son's instincts about matters of the heart. He was buttoning the blue shirt when his phone rang. Sarah's name appeared on the screen, and David felt that familiar flutter of happiness that had become associated with her voice. "Good morning," he answered, unable to keep the smile out of his tone. "David, I think we have a situation," Sarah said, and she sounded like she was trying not to laugh. "Tommy just called me with what he described as a chemistry emergency that requires my immediate attention at your house." David closed his eyes. What kind of chemistry emergency? He was very mysterious about the details, but he assured me it was totally safe but super important, and that I should bring my fanciest casual clothes because there might be educational photography involved. Educational photography? His words, not mine. He also specifically mentioned that I should bring the ingredients for those cookies you like because chemical reactions work better with proper fuel. David sank onto his bed, simultaneously impressed by and terrified of his son's elaborate scheming. "Sarah, I'm so sorry. I have no idea what he's planning, but—" "Are you kidding?" Sarah interrupted, and now she was definitely laughing. "I wouldn't miss this for the world. Tommy's schemes have led to some of the best days I've had in years. Besides, I'm curious to see what he considers a chemistry emergency." 30 minutes later, Sarah arrived at their front door carrying a bag of baking supplies and wearing a sundress that made David's brain temporarily short-circuit. She looked beautiful and happy, and completely prepared for whatever chaos Tommy had planned. "So," she said, stepping into the entryway, "where's our resident scientist?" "Tommy," David called toward the kitchen. "Sarah's here." "Coming." Tommy's voice came from the backyard, followed by the sound of something being dragged across the patio. They found Tommy in the backyard, standing proudly beside what appeared to be an elaborate setup involving his chemistry set, several household items, and a banner made from a bedsheet that read, "Official Family Chemistry Experiment," in Tommy's careful block letters. "Welcome," Tommy announced with the formality of a master of ceremonies, "to the most important scientific demonstration of my entire life." David looked around the backyard, taking in the carefully arranged chairs, the table covered with chemistry supplies, and what appeared to be a homemade photo booth complete with props and a tripod holding David's camera. "Tommy," David said slowly, "what exactly is this?" "This," Tommy said, gesturing grandly at his setup, "is a controlled experiment to test the hypothesis that our family has the perfect chemical composition for long-term stability and happiness." Sarah made a small sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. "That's actually pretty scientific." "I know, right?" Tommy beamed. "I've been working on it all week. See, I figured out that you and Dad keep saying you're taking things slow and being careful. But that's just because you haven't done the proper research to prove that you're already perfect together." David felt like he was watching his son conduct a romantic intervention using scientific methodology. "So," Tommy continued, "today we're going to document all the evidence that proves my hypothesis is correct. We're going to do chemistry experiments together, take pictures for our family album, and then Dad is finally going to ask you the question he's been too scared to ask." "What question?" Sarah asked, though her eyes were twinkling with amusement. Tommy rolled his eyes. "The girlfriend question, obviously. Dad likes you, you like Dad, I like both of you, and we all like each other. It's time to make it official." David felt his face burning with embarrassment and affection in equal measure. "Tommy, you can't just—" "Actually," Sarah said quietly, stepping closer to David, "I think Tommy's methodology is pretty sound." David looked at her, surprised. Really? Really? I mean, we have been conducting an extended experiment in family chemistry, haven't we? Kitchen disasters, grocery shopping, school plays. We've tested our compatibility under some pretty extreme conditions. Tommy nodded enthusiastically. Exactly. And all the data supports my hypothesis. You guys work together really well, even when I accidentally turn the kitchen purple or create foam explosions at school. Especially then, Sarah said, her gaze meeting David's. Anyone can get along when things are going smoothly. But you guys, you make chaos feel like fun. David looked at this woman who had somehow become essential to his happiness, standing in his backyard while his son orchestrated the world's most elaborate romantic setup, and realized that Tommy was absolutely right. They had been conducting an experiment in being a family, and all the evidence pointed to the same conclusion. Okay, David said, taking a deep breath. Let's do this experiment. For the next hour, they conducted Tommy's family chemistry tests, mixing safe solutions that created beautiful color changes, building structures out of everyday materials, and documenting everything with the camera Tommy had set up. But the real chemistry was happening between David and Sarah as they worked together, laughing at Tommy's running commentary and marveling at his elaborate documentation system. Final test, Tommy announced as they finished cleaning up their experiments. Dad, you have to ask Miss Chen the question now. For science. David looked at Sarah, who was smiling at him with such warmth and affection that his nervousness melted away completely. Sarah, he said, taking her hands in his, we've survived purple kitchens, grocery store ambushes, and foam explosions. We've proven that we work well together under pressure, that we make each other laugh, and that we're both completely willing to enable a 9-year-old's elaborate schemes if it makes him happy. All true, Sarah agreed, her eyes bright with unshed tears. So I guess what I'm asking is, would you like to make this official? Be my girlfriend? Join our chaos on a permanent basis? Yes, Sarah said without hesitation. Absolutely yes. Though I should warn you, I have some chemistry experiment ideas of my own. Tommy let out a whoop of triumph and immediately began documenting their first official kiss with his camera, providing running commentary about successful hypothesis confirmation and optimal romantic chemical reactions. As they broke apart laughing at Tommy's scientific observations about their embrace, David realized that his son had managed to orchestrate the perfect romantic moment disguised as a science experiment. Tommy's sabotage had evolved into matchmaking so sophisticated that David hadn't even seen it coming. So, Sarah said, still in David's arms, what happens now that your experiment is officially concluded? Tommy grinned and pulled out another folded paper from his pocket. Now we start planning the wedding. I've got some ideas about decorations and cake flavors and whether we can incorporate any safe chemical reactions into the ceremony. David and Sarah looked at each other and burst into laughter. One experiment at a time, buddy, David said, ruffling Tommy's hair. One experiment at a time. But as they headed inside to bake Sarah's cookies and plan their first official family movie night, David caught Tommy making notes in what appeared to be a new research journal titled, Wedding Planning: A Scientific Approach. Some things apparently never changed. Tommy was already 3 steps ahead of them, planning their next adventure with the methodical precision of a 9-year-old scientist who had just discovered that the best chemistry experiments were the ones that brought families together. And David couldn't wait to see what his son would come up with next. After all, Tommy's sabotage had turned out to be the best thing that had ever happened to all of them. The perfect storm had finally brought them home.